Joining me now is Chris Whipple, author of The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. Chris, welcome back to the broadcast. Let's get right to it. What does all of this tell you about how the White House is operating behind the scenes?
Well, you know, it's just more fallout from a terrible week for John Kelly. I mean, he really, this was a terrible blunder on Thursday, a self-inflicted wound when he went on that tirade against Representative Wilson and got all of his facts wrong. But, you know, in fairness to Kelly, this is what happens to almost everyone in the orbit of this Death Star known as Donald Trump, who diminishes and tarnishes everybody around him. You know, this should have been an easy thing to do. With any other president, you call the widow back, you apologize, end of story. But this president is incapable of empathy, incapable of apology. That has to be hugely frustrating to John Kelly.
Speaking of Kelly, he opened up about his own experience, and you talk about empathy and sympathy for him. I don't think there was anybody whose heart didn't go out to him as he talked about having lost his own son in Afghanistan. That notwithstanding, do you get a sense of how much influence he has or doesn't have in this White House? Well,
first of all, you know, he was eloquent on the subject of his son. He was eloquent on the subject of the fallen soldiers. But again, he veered off and lost control when he went after Representative Wilson. And I think that, you know, as for how much influence he has on Donald Trump, I talked to Dennis McDonough, President Obama's last chief of staff, who told me that he's been on the business end of some phone calls from General Kelly, and there's never any doubt that in his mind that he speaks hard truths. Another former Republican chief of staff told me, okay, if that's the case, how did Rocket Man get onto the teleprompter of the speech before the UN General Assembly? That's malpractice by the White House Chief of Staff, or it's evidence that Donald Trump isn't listening to Kelly.
So the comments by Frederica Wilson, the ones which John Kelly has gone after, they've been proven to be inaccurate. He didn't speak the truth about what she said, whether intentionally or not. Is it in his makeup as a four-star Marine general or as a chief of staff in a White House to issue an apology, or do you think that is something that just is part of the ether within this White House, the fact that everyone says this president is incapable of issuing apologies?
Well, it's certainly part of the ether, but I think we've learned a number of things about John Kelly this week. One of the things we've learned is that he's out of his depth politically. You know, the Jim Bakers, the Leon Panettas, the Ken Dubersteins, the Dennis McDonoughs, the really good White House chiefs of staff understood that when you stand in front of a camera, you're not speaking as a Marine, you're speaking as the White House chief of staff, and you have to stay above the fray. You know, even Dick Cheney, when he was Gerald Ford's 34-year-old White House chief of staff, his views were described as being to the right of Genghis Khan. And yet, Cheney was able to stay above the fray. He was always an honest broker. You never would have known what his politics were. He never got into the trenches to fight the partisan battles. And that's a lesson that Kelly, you know, is apparently unequipped for. He hasn't learned it because he doesn't have political experience.
The White House is still firmly defending General Kelly, as you know, and you've got a top White House official telling Axios that after the briefing, quote, Kelly has managed to make himself the moral core of the Trump administration. Chris, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, I think another thing we learned about John Kelly this week is that a lot of people thought he was the non-ideological grown-up in the room who would take the edge off of Donald Trump's excesses. Well, maybe not so much. I mean, I think in that tirade that he went on against Representative Wilson, we got a sense that he may share more of Donald Trump's views than we've realized up to this point. It may not be a safe bet that he's always going to be the grown-up in the room here, taking the edge off of Trump.
Okay, Chris Whipple, thank you very much for weighing in. We'll see you again, no doubt.